The first time my husband looked me in the eyes and chose someone else, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't even hesitate. He simply stepped aside and let his mother's silence become my sentence. I thought that moment would be the worst betrayal of my life. I was wrong. What happened after that made me realize the lie had started long before I ever noticed it. The strangest part was that everyone around me behaved as though nothing unusual had happened, as if I were the only person standing in a room where the floor had disappeared. By the time I understood why every family dinner, every birthday, every polite smile had felt slightly wrong, the truth had already been sitting in plain sight for years. I didn't know whether I had lost my marriage in a single afternoon or whether I had never truly had the marriage I believed I was protecting. I only knew that once the first secret revealed itself, every memory I trusted began changing shape. My name is Claire. I'm 63 years old, and until recently, I believed that patience could solve almost any family problem. I believed kindness eventually softens stubborn hearts. I believed that if you loved people consistently enough, they would remember that love when life became difficult. For 36 years, I built my marriage one ordinary day at a time. There were no grand gestures, no fairy tale moments, just countless mornings making coffee before sunrise, long conversations after work, quiet weekends repairing the house together, and holidays filled with traditions that seemed as solid as the oak tree growing in our front yard. My husband, Daniel, had always been close to his mother. Everyone knew that. Friends joked about it. Relatives rolled their eyes. Even I smiled through countless conversations where her opinion somehow carried more weight than anyone else's. I convinced myself that every family had its own peculiar balance. Besides, she never shouted at me. She rarely insulted me directly. Instead, she mastered something much more difficult to recognize. She questioned my choices with a gentle smile. She corrected my stories before anyone else could respond. She praised me only after reminding everyone how differently she would have handled the same situation. None of those moments seemed large enough to fight over. They were tiny cuts, spaced months apart, easy to dismiss individually. Looking back now, I understand that small wounds heal only if new ones stop appearing. Mine never did. Every Thanksgiving, every anniversary, every Sunday dinner added another invisible scratch until I no longer recognized the woman staring back from my bathroom mirror. Still, I stayed hopeful because Daniel always told me I was imagining things. "That's just how Mom is," he would say with a tired smile. "She doesn't mean anything by it." Those words became the soundtrack of our marriage. I repeated them to myself whenever another uncomfortable moment arrived. I repeated them because believing him was easier than accepting the possibility that the man who promised to stand beside me might never truly stand beside me at all. For years I accepted those words because they sounded reasonable. Families were complicated. Mothers worried. Sons felt responsible. I told myself that maturity meant letting little things go instead of keeping score. Whenever Evelyn corrected the way I arranged the Thanksgiving table, I smiled and moved another plate. Whenever she laughed softly and suggested that Daniel had always preferred her apple pie over mine, I laughed too, even though I had baked his favorite recipe for more than 3 decades. Whenever she insisted on changing plans we had already made together, Daniel would glance at me with that familiar expression that quietly asked me not to make things difficult. So I never did. I became the easy one, the understanding wife, the woman who always adjusted because everyone else seemed to need more room than she did. Looking back now, I realize I slowly disappeared inside that role. The changes happened so gradually that I barely noticed them. Daniel stopped asking my opinion before making family decisions. Vacation plans were discussed with his mother before they were discussed with me. Holiday schedules revolved around her preferences. Even our living room began filling with furniture she recommended because, according to Daniel, she had better taste. Friends complimented our home, never realizing that almost nothing inside it reflected the woman who cleaned it every day. The hardest part was not what Evelyn said. It was what Daniel never said. He never defended me. He never interrupted when she spoke over me. He never looked uncomfortable when she dismissed my ideas in front of relatives. Instead, he remained quiet until we drove home, where he would gently explain that I should not take everything so personally. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. Because the alternative was terrifying. If he saw exactly what I saw and still chose silence, Then our marriage rested on something far weaker than I had imagined. One rainy Saturday in early October, that uncomfortable feeling settled over me again. We had invited several family members for dinner the following weekend, and I spent the afternoon planning the menu while Daniel read the newspaper in the den. I asked whether he thought everyone would enjoy roasted chicken or pot roast. He barely looked up before saying, "You should call Mom. She probably already has ideas." It was such an ordinary sentence that he forgot it the moment he spoke it. I did not. I stood in my kitchen holding a wooden spoon, wondering why my own home no longer felt like a place where my choices mattered. I called anyway. Evelyn answered on the second ring, cheerful as always. Before I finished explaining my plans, she politely informed me that she had already invited everyone to her house instead. She said it had simply made more sense because her dining room was larger. She laughed lightly and added that she assumed Daniel had already told me. My heart sank. He had said nothing. When I walked into the den and quietly asked if he knew about the change, he folded his newspaper without surprise. "I forgot to mention it," he said. "Mom thought it would be easier." Easier. That single word lingered in the room long after our conversation ended. I smiled because that had become my habit, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet certainty began taking shape. This was no longer about dinners or traditions. Someone had been deciding where I belonged for a very long time, and I was beginning to fear that my husband had already agreed with every decision. The following Thursday I drove to the grocery store alone, hoping that an ordinary afternoon might quiet the uneasy thoughts that had followed me all week. I wandered through familiar aisles, filling my cart with things Daniel liked: fresh green beans, his favorite coffee, the vanilla ice cream he always asked for after Sunday dinner. Habit is a remarkable thing. Even when your heart begins questioning everything, your hands continue reaching for the life they have known for decades. As I turned into the produce section, I heard someone call my name. It was Margaret, a neighbor who had lived 3 streets away for nearly 20 years. We chatted about the changing weather, her grandchildren, and the upcoming church fundraiser. Then she smiled warmly and said something that stopped me cold. "Your mother-in-law certainly knows how to organize everyone. She told us you were relieved she had taken over family gatherings because hosting had become too much for you." I forced a polite smile even though I felt the air leave my lungs. "She said that." Margaret nodded without noticing the expression on my face. "She made it sound like she was helping you." I remember thinking it was generous of her. We said goodbye a few minutes later, but I remained standing beside a display of apples, unable to move. I had never told anyone I wanted to stop hosting. I had never even considered it. Somewhere along the way, a story had been written about me without my knowledge, and people I respected had accepted it as truth. On the drive home, every traffic light seemed longer than usual. I replayed countless conversations in my mind, wondering how many times I had unknowingly walked into a room where everyone believed a version of me that did not exist. When I reached the house, Daniel was sitting on the back patio reading on his tablet. I placed the grocery bags on the kitchen counter and quietly asked whether he had ever told people I no longer wanted to host family dinners. He looked genuinely confused for a moment before answering. "I might have mentioned you were getting tired of all the work. Mom probably filled in the rest." His voice carried no concern, only casual acceptance, as though changing my words into something entirely different was a harmless misunderstanding. I stared at him, waiting for him to realize why that mattered. He never did. Instead, he asked whether I wanted to order takeout because cooking looked like too much trouble after shopping. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not resentment. Just clarity. I finally understood that Daniel no longer questioned the stories his mother created because believing them was easier than asking me what was actually true. My silence had become convenient for everyone except me. That evening I opened an old photo album that had been sitting untouched on the bookshelf for years. Picture after picture showed birthdays, anniversaries, neighborhood cookouts, Christmas mornings, and smiling faces gathered around tables I had spent days preparing. I realized I was present in almost every photograph, yet somehow absent from every decision that had shaped our family in recent years. For the first time, I stopped asking myself how to keep the peace. Instead, I asked a question I should have asked years earlier. If the people who claimed to love me preferred a version of me that never spoke, what would happen when I finally decided to tell the truth? The next morning I did something I had not done in years. Instead of asking Daniel what he wanted for breakfast, I poured myself a cup of coffee, carried it onto the back porch, and allowed the silence to settle around me. The autumn air was cool, and a thin layer of dew covered the lawn we had planted together decades earlier. Everything looked exactly the same, yet I felt as though I had stepped into someone else's life. I closed my eyes and let old memories surface without trying to push them away. I remembered the first apartment Daniel and I shared after we were married. It was small enough that we could hear the neighbors through the walls, but we laughed constantly because every piece of furniture had been earned together. We painted those rooms ourselves. We counted every dollar before buying groceries. We dreamed about the future as though we were building it side by side. Back then, when his mother offered advice, he would smile politely and then ask what I thought before making any decision. Somewhere between those early years and the present, that simple habit disappeared. I could not identify the exact moment it happened. There was no dramatic argument, no unforgettable betrayal. Instead, it was replaced one quiet compromise at a time. Evelyn would suggest a different plan, Daniel would agree just to keep everyone happy, and I would convince myself that the issue was too small to matter. Then another decision followed, and another after that. One by one, my opinions became optional while hers became expected. I thought marriage could survive countless little disappointments as long as love remained. Now I wondered whether love could survive when respect quietly disappeared. Later that afternoon I opened a cabinet in the hallway, searching for an old photo frame, and a stack of greeting cards slipped onto the floor. They were anniversary cards Daniel had written during our first 15 years together. I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor and read every one of them. In each card he thanked me for being his partner, his closest friend, the person who made every house feel like home. His handwriting was younger, less careful, but every sentence sounded sincere. Tears never came. Instead, I felt a strange calm. The man who had written those words had once existed. I knew that because I had lived beside him. The question that haunted me was not whether he had loved me then. It was whether he had slowly allowed someone else's voice to become louder than his own, until he no longer recognized the promises he had made. That evening Daniel came home carrying a bakery box with my favorite lemon cake. He smiled as though nothing unusual had happened all week. "I thought this would cheer you up," he said warmly. I thanked him and placed the cake on the kitchen counter. For years that simple gesture would have erased every uncomfortable feeling I carried. This time it did not. Kindness without understanding suddenly felt incomplete. As we stood together in the quiet kitchen, I realized I was no longer searching for another apology that explained everything away. I was waiting for something far more important. I was waiting to discover whether my husband still knew the difference between keeping peace with his mother and breaking faith with his wife. 2 days later my niece Emily called and asked if she could stop by for coffee. She had always been thoughtful, the kind of young woman who noticed when someone smiled a little too quickly or answered a question a little too carefully. When she arrived, she hugged me longer than usual and looked around the kitchen with a quiet expression that suggested she had come for more than coffee. We spoke about work, the weather, and her new apartment before she finally rested both hands around her mug and asked, "Aunt Claire, are you really happy?" The question caught me off guard because no one had asked me that in years. People asked whether I was busy, whether dinner had gone well, whether Daniel was doing fine, but no one had asked about me. I smiled automatically before answering. "Why would you ask that?" Emily hesitated. "Because every time Grandma talks about family plans, she speaks as though she makes every decision. Everyone just accepts it. I always wondered why." I remained silent. She continued carefully, choosing every word with kindness. "Last month she told everyone that you preferred staying home because large gatherings exhausted you. But I remember asking you to come shopping with me that same weekend, and you said you had not even heard about the gathering." My hands tightened around my coffee cup. Hearing the same pattern from another person made it impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding. Emily was not trying to create conflict. She was simply describing what she had seen. "I thought maybe I was imagining it," she admitted. "But it keeps happening." I looked toward the window where the afternoon sunlight stretched across the backyard. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel completely alone inside my own memories. Someone else had noticed the invisible threads quietly pulling our family in one direction. "Thank you for telling me," I whispered. Emily reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. You have always been there for everyone else. I just wanted someone to be there for you. After she left, I sat in the quiet house replaying every word. I realized that Evelyn's influence had never depended on shouting or demanding control. She simply spoke first, spoke confidently, and repeated the same version of events until it became the accepted truth. The people around her were not necessarily cruel. Most of them simply believed the story they heard most often. That evening Daniel returned from work carrying grocery bags. He mentioned that his mother had invited us to Sunday lunch and added, almost as an afterthought, she already planned the menu because she said you probably needed a break. I looked at him for several seconds before answering. There was no anger in my voice, only calm. Did I tell anyone I wanted a break? He blinked, surprised by the question. No, but she assumed. I gently interrupted him. Daniel, when did assumptions about my life become more trustworthy than my own words? He opened his mouth but nothing came out. For the first time in many years, silence did not belong to me alone. It settled between us equally, asking a question neither of us could avoid any longer. I did not know what his answer would eventually be, but I knew something had already changed inside me. I was finished competing with a story that someone else had written. From that day forward, if people wanted to know who Claire really was, they would hear it from Claire herself. Sunday arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn morning that usually filled me with quiet anticipation. For years I had walked into Evelyn's house carrying homemade desserts, extra serving dishes, and the familiar determination to make every gathering pleasant no matter how uncomfortable I felt inside. This time I carried only a small bouquet of white flowers. It was not an act of defiance. It was simply the first time I chose not to solve problems that were never mine to solve. When we arrived, relatives were already filling the dining room with cheerful conversation. Evelyn welcomed everyone warmly before turning toward me with a smile that seemed carefully rehearsed. Claire, I was just telling everyone how grateful you are that I have been taking over these family lunches. It must be such a relief. Normally I would have smiled politely and allowed the moment to pass. Instead, I answered in the same calm voice I had used throughout my marriage. Actually, Evelyn, I have never said that. I always enjoyed hosting our family. The room became noticeably quieter, although no one appeared angry. They simply looked surprised. Evelyn laughed softly, waving one hand as though dismissing a harmless misunderstanding. Well, perhaps I misunderstood. 4 years that explanation would have ended the conversation. This time I gently continued. It seems there have been several misunderstandings lately. I think it is better if everyone hears directly from me, rather than through assumptions. No one spoke. I noticed Daniel watching both of us with an expression I had not seen before. He looked uncertain, almost as though he were hearing a familiar conversation in an entirely different language. Lunch continued, but something had shifted beneath the polite exchanges. My words had not embarrassed anyone. They had simply interrupted a pattern that had existed for so long everyone had stopped noticing it. During dessert my brother-in-law asked whether I was planning to stop hosting Thanksgiving as well. Before Evelyn could answer for me, I smiled and replied, No. In fact, I have already started planning it. I hope everyone can come. Several relatives exchanged puzzled glances. One of my cousins admitted that she had been told I wanted quieter holidays and preferred staying home. Another confessed she had believed I was gradually stepping away from family traditions. As each person spoke, I realized how many quiet stories had been told on my behalf without a single conversation involving me. Daniel remained unusually silent. On the drive home he kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel. The road stretched ahead of us in complete silence until he finally spoke. I did not know people believed those things. I looked out the window at rows of maple trees glowing orange beneath the afternoon sun. That is because you never asked where those stories came from, I answered gently. He nodded once without defending himself. It was a small gesture, but after years of automatic explanations it felt different. Later that evening he walked into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. He sat beside me instead of across from me. After several quiet moments he asked a question I had waited years to hear. Claire, how long have you felt alone in our marriage? I did not answer immediately because there was no simple number. Loneliness had not arrived all at once. It had settled into our lives, one overlooked conversation, one surrendered decision, and one unanswered moment at a time. As I finally began telling him the truth, I realized I was no longer speaking to avoid conflict. I was speaking because my own voice had become too important to lose again. Daniel listened without interrupting. That alone felt unfamiliar. I spoke quietly, not because I was afraid, but because I no longer needed my voice to compete with anyone else's. I told him about the dinners where I smiled while feeling invisible, the conversations where his mother's opinions became final before I even knew a decision had been made, the holidays I spent preparing for only to discover the plans had already changed without me. I reminded him of moments he probably no longer remembered, ordinary afternoons that had seemed too small to matter at the time. Yet those ordinary afternoons had slowly become the foundation of a life where my place grew smaller every year. He stared into his untouched cup of tea for a long time before speaking. I always thought I was keeping everyone together, he admitted quietly. I believed avoiding arguments was the same as protecting our family. I nodded because I understood why he had believed that. Peace can be comforting when you never ask who is paying its price. You were protecting the quiet, I replied gently. You were not protecting us. My words were not meant to wound him. They were simply true. The following morning Daniel surprised me by making breakfast before I came downstairs. The table was already set with fresh fruit, toast, and coffee. It reminded me of the early years of our marriage when we found joy in simple gestures. As we ate, he asked whether I would help him understand something. When did you stop telling me these things? I smiled sadly. Around the same time you stopped believing them. He lowered his eyes. Neither of us argued because there was nothing left to defend. Later that afternoon his phone rang. Evelyn's name appeared on the screen. He answered while standing near the kitchen window. I could not hear her words, but I could recognize the familiar rhythm of the conversation. She was speaking for a long time while he listened. Normally he would have agreed with almost everything she suggested. Instead, after several minutes, I heard him say calmly, "Mom, I need to ask Claire first. It is our home and our decision." The room became completely still. It was such an ordinary sentence, yet I realized I had waited years to hear it. He ended the call a few moments later and turned toward me with an uncertain expression. She was not happy, he admitted. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the situation suddenly seemed so clear. For years everyone had adjusted their expectations to keep one person comfortable, while expecting everyone else to quietly adapt. The moment that pattern changed, discomfort appeared immediately. That evening we took a slow walk through our neighborhood. Fallen leaves covered the sidewalks, and children rode bicycles beneath trees glowing with shades of red and gold. Daniel reached for my hand without saying a word. I let him hold it, but I also understood something important. A single kind gesture could not erase years of silence. Trust was not rebuilt through promises. It was rebuilt through choices repeated day after day. As we returned home, I noticed the porch light shining against the gathering dusk. For the first time in a very long while, the house no longer felt like a place where my voice disappeared. It felt like a place where the truth had finally been invited inside, and neither of us could pretend not to hear it anymore. The changes did not happen overnight, and perhaps that was what made them real. Daniel no longer answered every phone call from his mother the moment it arrived. Sometimes he let it ring while we finished dinner. Sometimes he called her back after asking whether I had already made plans for the evening. They were small decisions, almost invisible to anyone outside our home, yet each one quietly restored something I had believed was gone forever. I did not celebrate those moments because I had learned that lasting change does not need applause. It only needs consistency. A week later we began preparing for Thanksgiving together. For the first time in many years, Daniel asked what menu I wanted instead of assuming someone else had already decided. We sat at the kitchen table with a notebook between us, writing recipes and grocery lists exactly as we had done during our early years of marriage. As we planned the afternoon, he suddenly looked up and asked, "What traditions have you missed the most?" The question lingered in the room because it carried something deeper than curiosity. It carried regret. I smiled softly before answering. I missed feeling like this was our family instead of someone else's schedule. He nodded without trying to explain himself. There were no excuses left, only quiet understanding. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Evelyn called again. This time she suggested moving the celebration to her house because, in her opinion, it would be more convenient for everyone. Daniel thanked her for the offer and calmly explained that we had already invited the family to our home. There was a long pause before she replied. Even from across the room I could hear the disappointment in her voice. When he ended the call, he did not look relieved. He looked thoughtful. "I should have done that years ago," he admitted. I placed my hand over his. "You cannot change yesterday," I said gently. "You can only decide who you want to be tomorrow." Thanksgiving morning arrived bright and cold. The smell of roasted turkey filled the house while cinnamon and fresh bread drifted through every room. One by one our relatives arrived carrying pies, flowers, and bottles of sparkling cider. Something felt different almost immediately. Instead of asking Evelyn where dishes belonged, people asked me. Instead of waiting for someone else to organize the afternoon, conversations happened naturally around the kitchen island, while everyone helped set the table. Emily caught my eye from across the room and smiled. She did not need to say a word. She already knew what this day meant to me. During dinner, my brother-in-law raised his glass and thanked Daniel and me for hosting. Before anyone could change the subject, Daniel quietly cleared his throat. "There is something I want to say," he began. Every conversation stopped. He looked at me before speaking to the rest of the family. For a long time I allowed other people to speak for Claire instead of listening to her myself. I thought I was avoiding conflict, but I was creating distance where there should have been trust. I am grateful she never stopped believing our marriage was worth fighting for. No one applauded. No one offered dramatic reactions. They simply listened. Across the table, Evelyn lowered her eyes without saying a word. For once, silence no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the truth. And the truth had finally found a seat at our family table. The days after Thanksgiving felt lighter, but they were not effortless. Healing rarely announces itself with dramatic moments. More often it arrives quietly, hidden inside ordinary routines that suddenly feel different. Daniel and I returned to simple habits we had forgotten. We shared breakfast without checking our phones. We worked together in the yard on Saturday mornings. We talked in the evenings without the television filling every silence. None of those moments erased the past, yet each one reminded me that trust grows through daily choices instead of grand promises. A few weeks later, Evelyn invited us to her house for Sunday lunch. Daniel looked at me before answering, something he had begun doing naturally. "Would you like to go?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but it carried more respect than dozens of expensive gifts ever could. I thought about it for a moment before nodding. "Yes," I replied, "but only if we go as partners." He smiled gently. "That is exactly how we will go." When we arrived, the atmosphere felt unfamiliar. The house looked the same, the framed family photographs still lined the hallway, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the kitchen. Yet something invisible had changed. Relatives greeted me warmly, asking about my holiday recipes and complimenting the Thanksgiving dinner. Instead of directing every conversation herself, Evelyn remained unusually quiet. I could sense that she was watching everyone carefully, perhaps trying to understand why the familiar pattern no longer worked. During lunch she mentioned that Christmas might be easier if everyone simply followed the schedule she had already prepared. Before anyone responded, Daniel calmly placed his fork on the table. "Mom," he said kindly, "let us hear what everyone wants before making plans." There was no anger in his voice, only confidence. The room remained peaceful, but I noticed several family members exchange thoughtful glances. For the first time, decisions were becoming conversations instead of announcements. Emily smiled at me from across the table. My brother-in-law suggested combining traditions from different households. Even 2 of my cousins offered to host future gatherings during the summer. What surprised me most was how easily the family adapted once everyone realized they were allowed to have a voice. After lunch, Evelyn asked if she could speak with me privately on the back porch. The December air carried the scent of pine trees, and the neighborhood looked peaceful beneath a pale winter sky. She folded her hands together before speaking. "I always believed I was helping," she said quietly. I listened without interrupting. After a long pause, I answered honestly, "Perhaps that was how it began. But somewhere along the way, helping became deciding, and deciding became speaking for me. She lowered her eyes. There was no dramatic apology, no emotional confession that suddenly repaired years of distance. Instead, she nodded slowly, as though hearing a truth she had avoided for a long time. "I will try to do better," she whispered. I appreciated the words, but I had learned not to measure change by promises alone. As Daniel and I drove home beneath the fading afternoon sun, I looked out the window and realized something unexpected. My greatest victory had never been convincing someone else that I deserved respect. It had been remembering that I never needed anyone's permission to speak with my own voice, and once I reclaimed it, the people who truly loved me finally learned how to listen.